Myths and legends are a wonderful part of who we are. Some myths are unique, but many share a common theme repeated again and again across many cultures. One of these common myths is the existence of little people. In Irish legend, there are the leprechauns, tiny fairies who love gold, making shoes and playing practical jokes. There are a whole array of the little folk in Celtic folklore, including fairies and elves. They are often associated with mischief and are generally hidden, keeping out of view of the rest of the human population. Many Native American stories tell of the little people who lived in woods or sometimes hid in rocks near large bodies of water. Like their European counterparts, they could often be pranksters, but would sometimes also take children away from abusive parents. But for this lecture, I'd like to take you to the island of Flores in Indonesia and accounts of the little folk that mythology talks about there. Flores is part of the Lesser Sunda Islands, which forms one of the many island chains of the area. Geologically, Indonesia is complex, sitting at the meeting point of several tectonic plates. In the east, the Pacific Plate is in collision with both the Indo-Australian and the Philippine Plate, and in the west, the Eurasian Plate is colliding with the Indo-Australian Plate. The island of Flores is part of the Sunda Arc, a volcanic arc that includes the islands of Sumatra and Java and many smaller islands. This arc marks where the oceanic part of the Indo-Australian Plate is being subducted below the Eurasian Plate, forming both the Sunda Arc and the deep Sunda or Java Trench. It was the site of the devastating Sumatra Andaman earthquake and tsunami of December 26, 2004. This grinding tectonic activity is also the reason why this area is one of the most volcanically active areas of the world. It includes Mount Tambora, which erupted in 1815 and is regarded as being the most violent in recent recorded human history, and Krakatoa, which erupted in 1883, held to be the loudest noise in human history and responsible for the deaths of over 36,000 people. The complex tectonics of this area is also responsible for the deep ocean trenches separating the islands, which is why, even during times of low sea level, such as occurs during ice ages, many of these islands have always been separated from mainland Asia and Australia. Flores lies in between two biogeographic boundaries, the Wallace Line, west of which fauna and flora are Asian in character, and the Lydekkers Line, east of which animals have more of an Australian flavour. You may remember we first discussed this area when we were considering the wonderful Komodo dragon in an earlier lecture. The area between these lines is known as Wallacea, named after naturalist and contemporary of Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, who noticed these biogeographical divisions. But getting back to the little people of Flores. In the local Nage language, they are called the Ebu Gogo, which roughly translates into English as grandmother who eats anything, or perhaps even granny glutton. They're described as being fast runners, about 1.5 meters tall, with broad faces and very hairy bodies. The Ebu Gogo are said to have their own language, but could repeat parrot-like phrases said to them in the Nage language. The Nage people hold that the Ebu Gogo still had a presence on the island when Portuguese trading vessels arrived in the 16th century. Some claim that there were occasional sightings of these little folks even into the 20th century. Nage folklore tells of a somewhat troubled relationship between the two groups of people, though. The Ebu Gogo were often blamed for stealing food and kidnapping children. The Nage tell how they finally decided to rid themselves of these troublesome little folk. As a gift, the Nage provided the Ebu Gogo with palm fibre to make clothes. The Ebu Gogo took this back to their caves, but the villagers threw a firebrand in after them, setting the palm fibre alight and killing the cave dwellers, although legend does say that a pair escaped into the forest. Similar stories of little people are found on the island of Sumatra, where they are called the Orang Pendek, meaning simply short person, where they're said to live in forested mountains on the island and stand about 80 to 150 centimetres tall. Like the Ebu Gogo, they are blamed for raiding food, but are often described as being very strong for their size. So in this episode, I'd like to ask, What paleontological secrets does the island of Flores hold? Where does Homo floresiensis fit into our story? Just who were Homo floresiensis? Although little folk are common characters in mythology, no one would have suggested that any might actually have existed. At least, that was what you might have thought, until a team of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists made a fantastic discovery on the island of Flores back in 2003. Tantalising stone tools had been discovered previously by Father Theodore Verhoeven in the 1950s. He was a priest who worked in a seminary on the island. Dutch and Indonesian archaeologists in the 1990s dated similar tools to around 700,000 years before the present, suggesting that human ancestors, probably Homo erectus, had migrated to the islands of Indonesia long before the evolution of modern humans at about 200,000 years ago. So Flores was probably a really good place to go hunt for these earliest migrants making their way across the East Indies. In 2001, an Indonesian-Australian team, co-led by Dr. Mike Morwood of the University of Wollongong, Australia, began excavations at a large limestone cave called Liang Boa, meaning cool cave. They dug for 2 years, first finding an arm bone and then about a year later a tooth. And then, on September 6, 2003, they hit the jackpot. One of the locally hired excavators, Benjamin Taurus, exposed a top of a skull called LB1 at about 6 meters, around 20 feet below the cave floor. This was a small individual, about 1.06 meters, weighing about 30 kilograms, and looked like a female child. At least that is what it looked like, till the teeth were examined. And then came a surprise. The jaw contained wisdom teeth that were fully exposed and also demonstrated signs of wear. This was no child, but a tiny adult, about 30 years old, dating to very recent geological times. It was suggested about 18,000 years old. Fragments of 12 other individuals were recovered associated with this skeleton, as were stone tools. In addition, charcoal was found suggesting the use of fire. The initial dates obtained for these discoveries overlap with the time that humans are known to have arrived in Indonesia at about 45,000 years before the present day. Could these little fossils be the remains of the elusive Ebu Gogo? And could they have coexisted with modern humans? The discovery generated a media storm, and very quickly these little folk were given the name the Flores Hobbits by the media after the little people in J.R.R. Tolkien's books. Scientifically, they were named Homo floresiensis, a member of our own genus and part of the taxonomic tribe called hominins, comprising modern humans and their ancestors. The discovery also generated immediate controversy. Part of the problem centred around Floresiensis' brain, which at 400 cc's places it in the range of chimps. This flies in the face of our understanding of our human evolution, which demonstrates the advance of upright walking apes evolving progressively larger brains. Now here is Floresiensis, potentially coexisting with modern humans, but possessing a tiny brain. Many were unhappy with the idea of these fossils being a new species of human. The head Indonesian anthropologist, Teuku Jacob, after examining the remains, declared that they resembled modern humans suffering from a condition known as microcephaly. This is a rare neurological disorder generally associated with dwarfism and characterised by people with very small brains and heads and often diminished mental capacity and a characteristic sloping forehead. This is the condition that the Zika virus can cause. Finding the skull of Homo floresiensis, though, allowed the production of an endocast, an internal cast that gives us a picture of the external surface of the brain, even though the original organ might have long since rotted away. When examined, it was found that, unlike microcephalic brains, Homo floresiensis brain had very well developed frontal lobes, and in particular, an area called Brodmann Area 10 was proportionally of similar size to that of modern humans. In modern humans, this is the area of the brain involved with higher cognition and allows for something called cognitive branching. Cognitive branching allows you to come back to something later in your mind so that you can get on with something else that demands your attention right now. As such, it may allow you to multitask. This is a feature of complex analytical thinking. Does this explain the presence of stone tools in the cave and evidence for the use of fire? Could it also explain the butchered remains of extinct pygmy elephants called Stegodon florensis insularis? This animal was about the size of a cow, but would still have been a challenge for an individual under 4 feet tall. Could this imply group hunting, a complex social structure requiring advanced cognition and perhaps speech? Other explanations by pathology to try and explain these fossils as humans with pathologies also included congenital hypothyroidism, which can be found in the local population of Flores, and could also account for small bodies and brains. And more recently, in 2014, it was suggested that the LB1 skull demonstrates something called craniofacial asymmetry, a sign of Down syndrome, although Australian researchers counter this and state that it is likely a feature of the skull's preservation and damage during extraction. Needless to say, this is a very controversial find, but just for now, let's suppose that this is a real human ancestor, a close relative but not a member of Homo sapiens. Where does Homo floresiensis fit into our story? To understand this, let's review a little of our own family tree. Molecular evidence suggests that the last common ancestor between humans, gorillas and chimpanzees occurs sometime as early as 8 million years ago, during the late Miocene. The Miocene is often described as the golden age of apes, with a much higher diversity of apes and possible hominins too. In truth, fossils from this golden age can be scarce, in part due to the acidity of the soils in the tropical forests in which these early apes lived. And so sorting out the direct evolutionary relationships between them can be tricky. But perhaps something like Oranopithecus, an extinct ape recovered from Greece and Bulgaria around 8 million years ago, could be close to the first true primate on the human branch. Closer to us in time, at 4.4 million years ago, is Ardipithecus, who has been described as a strange mosaic of a creature. It is thought, from the position of a feature called the foramen magnum, that Ardipithecus might have walked upright. In apes, this feature is positioned at the back of the skull, but in upright human walking primates, like humans and Ardipithecus, it is right under the skull, reflecting the fact that we are upright and balancing this large melon on the top of our spines. Ardipithecus still possesses many ape-like features though, with long arms and chimp-like feet with opposable thumbs. But probably the most famous of our early human ancestors is Lucy, or Australopithecus afarensis. Lucy was recovered from Hadar in Ethiopia and is dated to about 3.2 million years ago. She's a lot more human-looking than Ardipithecus, with fewer tree-climbing adaptations and a much more human-looking foot. Even though she walked upright, Lucy still retained some tree-climbing characteristics like strong arms and curved fingers. Although on the path to modern humans, Lucy still had a head and brain similar to that of a chimp, with a brain about a third the size of a typical human today. As a species, Australopithecus afarensis is found between 3.85 and 2.95 million years ago, making it one of the longest-lived human species. Lucy was discovered by John Johansen in 1974, but since then, species that have been found earlier have also been incorporated into this species. With these and new discoveries, we now have around 300 individuals in various collections around the world. Eventually, Lucy, or a similar upright walking ape, would give rise to the first member of our own genus, Homo. The oldest fossil evidence we have comes from Homo habilis, or handyman, who lived around 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago. As his name suggests, handyman was demonstrating definite evidence of tool use. Homo habilis was discovered by the famous paleoanthropologist Jonathan Leakey in 1960. Its brain was a little larger than Lucy's and slightly less ape-like, but still demonstrated protrusive jaws. They were short compared to modern humans, about 100 to 135 centimetres, with an average weight of about 32 kilograms. Our first really human-looking ancestor was Homo erectus. From a distance, you would have probably thought that it was a modern human. Their bodies looked very much like ours, but if they were to turn around and look at you, you would see a face that was still very ape-like. Their brain, although larger than previous hominins at 900 cc's, was still much smaller than our own, that is about 1,300 cubic centimetres. Homo erectus is considered to be a highly variable species, and many subgroups have been identified. Some of the oldest Homo erectus fossils have been found in Dmanisi, Georgia, Homo erectus georgicus. Some have suggested that this opens the possibility that Africa may not necessarily be the cradle of all human ancestors. Perhaps some of our evolutionary history has a bit of an Asian origin too. Whatever Homo erectus's origins were, they were certainly travellers. Their travels, and likely the migration of other creatures too, were aided by changing environmental conditions that would allow for the development of a wet Sahara and the opening up of a grassland corridor along the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes called Savannistan. As grasslands opened up, animals migrate, and Homo erectus, known to be hunters, would follow, an effect sometimes called the Sahara pump. It is possible that it would be this pump that would allow erectus to reach Java by about 1.5 million years ago. In fact, it was in Java that the first Homo erectus fossil was found by Eugene Dubois. Dubois was born in Limburg in the Netherlands. His father was mayor of the town, but Eugene appeared to be more interested in natural history and in exploring the local mines of Mount St. Peter, from which a skull of a Mosasaurus was discovered back in 1765. As an adult, he had a promising career as an anatomist, but became increasingly interested in human origins, perhaps inspired by the Neanderthal finds that were being found in various locations in Europe at that time. It is said that, much to the surprise and perhaps dismay of his colleagues, he gave up his university position and joined the Dutch army to be posted to the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, where he was convinced he would find the human missing link. His logic possibly had something to do with Dubois being intrigued by Wallace's accounts of the area, in which he described the presence of numerous caves. At the time, caves were the only places human fossils had been found. So off he set to hot, malaria-ridden Sumatra, towing his wife and young daughter with him. Apparently, his responsibilities in the army were pretty light, so he could spend a lot of time looking for fossils. Moving to Java, he would start to amass an enormous collection of animal fossils and eventually struck fossil gold in 1891. He discovered a skull cap, tooth and a thigh bone of a species he describes as being in between humans and apes. He named it Pithecanthropus erectus, ape human that stands upright, although it was commonly referred to as Java man. Today, of course, we know it as Homo erectus. During his time in the Dutch East Indies, Dubois would suffer from various tropical illnesses and would tragically lose his daughter to disease too. It took a long time for the scientific community to accept his find as a human ancestor, and this resistance, and perhaps the personal price he paid in finding his famous fossil, may explain why he is reported to have died in 1940, a bitter man. It is thought that Homo sapiens likely evolved from a group of Homo erectus in Africa about 200,000 years ago and spread out from there, replacing Homo erectus and other species like Neanderthals, and ultimately becoming the only living species of human on Earth. But who was Homo floresiensis? This is an important question. If not Homo sapiens, then from whom in our family tree did Homo floresiensis evolve? The most obvious candidate would be Homo erectus, the only other human ancestor we have evidence of in Indonesia. But how does a large human ancestor shrink to about 3 foot 6 inches? To answer that, we once again turn to consider some of the strange things that can happen to animals on islands. As we mentioned in a previous lecture, it is known that on islands, former mainland species over a number of generations can start to experience dramatic changes in size, effects that we call insular dwarfism or gigantism. Examples of dwarfism include the 200-kilogram dwarf hippos on Cyprus The modern hippos are around about 1,500 kilograms. We find diminutive sauropod dinosaurs from Transylvania, an island in the Cretaceous at that time that were only 6 meters long compared to their 30-meter-long relatives on the mainland. And consider this, tiny little chameleon, Bruxia micra, discovered on the island of Madagascar in 2007. This is a juvenile, but adults only reach about 29 millimeters long. On the other side of the scale, there is the familiar old dodo from Mauritius, which was actually an expanded flightless pigeon, about 1 meter tall. And horse eagle from the South Island of New Zealand, which at 12 kilograms for a large male probably evolved to prey on the giant moa. And then Archaeoindris, a lemur that evolved to the size of a gorilla on Madagascar and may have only gone extinct about 350 years ago. These changes can be due to a number of factors. Growing large on an island may be due to a lack of predators that you no longer have to hide from. Shrinking in size can help if resources are limited and the territory available for your seeking food is much reduced. On Flores, there are examples of dwarfism and gigantism too. Homo floresiensis might have hunted giant rats like Papagomis with bodies about 45 centimeters long and a tail 70 centimeters long. Twice the size of the average brown rat. I would not want to find any of these living in my basement. There were giant storks, Leptoptilus robustus, and the pygmy elephant Stegodon florensis insularis that we've covered earlier. We also have to mention, although probably not an example of the island effect, the intimidating carnivorous Komodo dragon, some of which can reach 3 meters in length, that were ambling around Flores and whom we met in a previous lecture. And of course, there is Homo floresiensis herself. Could this little creature be a dwarf Homo erectus? If this is the case, then this is a branch of an extremely successful and widespread human ancestor that survived hidden until very recently. Some, though, are unhappy with the island effect hypothesis to explain Homo floresiensis, in part because island dwarfism does not usually see a reduction in brain size like we see in Homo floresiensis. With all the other evidence presented, though, it is compelling. But could Homo floresiensis represent something much more ancient? Is it possible that Homo floresiensis has not undergone island shrinking? Could this little human have arrived at Flores already small? Dr. Matt Tocherry of the Smithsonian's Human Origin Program was intrigued by the wrist bones of this tiny human.
My PhD research had been looking at the wrist anatomy of not only our species but our close relatives, the great apes, as well as looking at other human fossil wrist bones. And what's really interesting is in our wrist, as well as the wrist of Neanderthals, we have several features in our wrist bones that are quite different than what we see in earlier hominins or in African apes. There's been a big change, basically, in the evolution of our wrist, and we see that change only in Neanderthals and us. And what was so striking to me was the fact that LB1, this specimen of Homo floresiensis, still has the condition we see in earlier hominins as well as African apes. So for me, this was very clear evidence that this is not a diseased modern human. This is basically a very close relative to ours, but a different lineage of human.
So, could it be that Homo floresiensis is descended from an earlier ancestor like Homo habilis, or with the even more ancient Australopithecines like Lucy? The problem with this earlier than erectus migration is this, though. Unlike Homo erectus, Lucy and her kind, the Australopithecines and Homo habilis, are not known out of Africa. It is conceivable, however, that the Saharan pump could have allowed for their migration, just as it did for Homo erectus. If this is the case, Homo floresiensis may represent some of the earliest human wanderers. Perhaps we will find their fossils in the future, but so far, nothing. Perhaps we have another way forward, though. We are already mapping the Neanderthal genome, so how about Homo floresiensis? Attempts have been made on teeth found at Liang Bua, but so far without success. This might be due to the tropical conditions in which the fossils were found. When excavated, they were described as having a consistency of wet blotting paper. Perhaps future fossil finds will provide better preserved material and put to rest the origin of these remarkable little humans. And what happened to the fantastic ecosystem of pygmies and giants on the island of Flores? This ecosystem of tiny humans hunting giant rats and dodging the scary Komodo dragons? As we already noted, this is a very volcanically active part of the world. The volcanoes in Indonesia are dangerous, very different from the generally benign volcanic eruptions we see on an island, say, like Hawaii. These are explosive and capable of generating pyroclastic flows, hot flows of gas and rock that can reach speeds of around about 700 kilometers per hour and temperatures of 1,000 degrees centigrade. They can also be responsible for lahars, a volcanic debris flow composed of a slurry of pyroclastic material and various materials flowing with the consistency of wet concrete. You can see one here that developed on Mount Galunggung in West Java in 1982. The fossils, along with some of the giant storks and pygmy elephants, were found below a thick layer of volcanic ash. Perhaps then a volcanic disaster ended the wonderful world of the little people of Flores. A large volcanic event in this part of the world could easily disrupt a finely balanced island ecosystem, taking Floresiensis and the other wonderful giants and pygmies of the island into extinction. It is possible, of course, that they survived only to be wiped out by the modern people of Flores, as described in the legend of the Ebu Gogo. Unfortunately, the idea that they coexisted with modern humans for an extended period of time has recently received a blow. Research published in the journal Nature in 2016 has provided a much more accurate date for the fossils in the cave at Liangbua. The oldest fossil remains appear to be about 60,000 years old, with tools dating to about 50,000 years, and not the previous recent dates that were recorded. If they ever did coexist with humans, it is likely that, as soon as our species started to spread across the Lesser Sunda Islands, they were simply outcompeted and driven into extinction. Even so, it would be nice to think that they are still furtively slipping through the forest of Indonesia. In addition to the legends of the Orang Pendek on Sumatra, there have been more recent accounts from Dutch colonists in the 1920s of short bipedal creatures in the forest. Between 2005 and 2009, a camera trapping project was funded by the National Geographic in the hope of snapping a shot of the mysterious creature in the woods, without success. Of course, the accounts of little folk in legend, or the more recent sightings, could just be a case of mistaken identity, other primates, or perhaps the sun bear which can stand up on two legs. But personally, I would love there to be another member of our family out there. We are the only remaining species of the genus Homo, a unique circumstance for our family, which has often seen many different peoples sharing this planet. In a way, we are an endangered genus. Just imagine, though, what we could learn from our cousins, what stories they could tell us, and how they could help us understand our own place in the family tree. Even without living little people from Flores, the search for the understanding of human history goes on. It's going to be a fascinating ride.